the word to you, Danny. How does our immune system react when we get any kind of infection? And what does it make react so particular to COVID in the first place, I should say?
People have learned a lot, haven't they, about immunity to SARS-CoV-2. And I think everybody's come to understand about the vaccines and the immunity. So if I race through that in half a minute, we came to understand that it affected us so badly in 2020 because we hadn't seen that virus before and we didn't have immunity to it. And we went through that terrifying period when there were people having pneumonias and being hospitalized and dying in enormous numbers because we had no immunity to it. And we were all racing to try and understand immunity. And, as you fast forward through the story, we realize that there's this very important antigen on the virus called spike, and that's very much involved in attachment of the virus to human cells, and that if you've got high levels of antibody to spike that can neutralize it, you can be protected. And we gradually built up this narrative of what immunity to the virus looks like. And obviously, by the end of 2020, we're very good all around the world at rolling out different vaccines that could promote that kind of immunity. And then things started to be a tiny bit less scary, not enormously less scary, but somewhat less scary. So, where are we today? We're on a planet where there's variable levels of protective immunity to the virus out there from this accumulation of infections by the different variants, reinfections, and vaccinations, so that we're all a little bit less scared than we were in 2020. And it's much less common to hear about people dying of COVID, although every affected country still has tens of thousands of excess deaths every year from COVID. And yet we haven't won the battle yet, have we? Because everybody we know works in an environment, goes to school in an environment where reinfections are common, breakthrough infections in vaccinated people are common, and we're still paying a very high price for it, yeah? So, so many people are out of work, so many people are out of school. So that's kind of where we are on normal immunity to COVID-19. And the only other thing I'd add is for the aficionados is that they'll appreciate that by now, I think that the immune system has different aspects to it, different components. We talk a lot about antibodies and protective antibodies, and the advanced students will realize that there's also a cellular part of the immune system where the most important part of that are the T cells, and the T cells are clever cells that go around and are there to kill virus-infected cells. And where we are now, 4 years on, our immune program is very much a composite of our antibody and T-cell immunity, where we almost think less nowadays about those neutralizing antibody responses to spike and more about the role played by those patrolling T-cells keeping the virus down. So sorry, that's a very long answer to your starting question about where are we and what's the impact of COVID?
No, that's really good. I appreciate it. I'd seize that opportunity and ask you if you could just give us a little bit of an idea of how the immune system in general works. Like, what is a T cell, a B cell, and what is the current state of knowledge, how they respond when things go haywire?
Yeah. So this is quite a difficult discussion, I think, to have now in the world and the context of COVID and long COVID, because, well, I suppose because people are very activist and activated about the subject and very disturbed by the subject, because many people out there are very ill with their long COVID. I'm still amazed that people haven't all appreciated, politicians haven't appreciated what a big deal this is. So we were the first, I think, to estimate that if you do the calculations for how many people in the world are affected by long COVID, it's about 400 million, we would think. And that calculation was reproduced a couple of weeks ago in Nature Medicine by another group. So, we have 400 million people disturbed by this in the world, we estimate. And that's huge, yeah? That's, in many countries, that's 3% of the workforce. That's lost GDP of over 2%. And we calculate that as something like, globally, something like $1 trillion per year of impact. So when people are that, disturbed by it, they start to think about hypotheses and about the immune system, and there are a lot of ideas out there. And while I'm not being, a sort of stuffy professor saying this is very complicated and I understand it and you don't, the immune system is a really complex place. Okay, so I spent my whole life working on it, and when we talk about the different populations of white blood cells that are protecting you from viruses or bacteria or fungi or cancer, we can use very fancy machines to separate your T cells into thousands of different subsets, your B cells into thousands of different subsets, your natural killer cells. So there's a lot of diversity out there. Okay. So it's not always intuitive to count it or measure it and say, do you have good immunity or do I have bad immunity or strong immunity or weak immunity? It's that's without being rude or patronizing, it's complex, yeah. And so the reason I give all of that preamble is that people with long COVID have become very, I don't know, very sort of discerning immunologists with lots of immunological theories about the condition. And sometimes I worry that theories fly around that where I can't always see the evidence. So, in a minute, maybe we'll talk about, where do I think there's good evidence for what's causing things and what's happening. But sometimes I get worried that people are kind of extrapolating and saying, oh, it's just like HIV. It destroys your immune system. And I feel like I've never, ever, I've looked hard. I've never seen the evidence for that. Or it's definitely to do with an overactive immune system or an underactive immune system. I've never seen strong evidence for either of those. So I suppose the reason I worry is not to be a snob or anything, but just because if there are a lot of theories flying around in a slightly uncontrolled way, it can make people with long COVID very easy pickings for people who want to exploit them, make them pay for tests that are irrelevant, make them pay for treatments that are irrelevant. And I think we owe it to ourselves as a community to try and do the right thing and do the job well and sensibly and, make people better and not just, charge them money for stuff.
Absolutely agree. This is something that we've been observing, right? If you remember, there was I think a clinic in Germany that from the outset of like when the first long COVID cases popped up, they would offer HELP apheresis treatments. It's essentially like cleaning or cleansing your blood from microclots and the likes with heparin. And we've seen that they make a lot of bank, like they earn a lot of money with those treatments, but there is no conclusive evidence that says, okay, this is definitely helpful for this. So that's like, I don't want to say that's exploiting it already, but there's a lot of other treatments out there that people would just jump to in their desperation, and I can understand that desperation. So the goal is here actually, yes, to find some clarity and to like discern a little bit to what is speculation, what is hypotheses that are still in the process of being proved, and what is already known. And you already hinted at that. So yes, maybe we can touch on that a little bit. Just like, so what do we know about the immunology of long COVID today, and what is still hypothesis, so to speak?
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that. So again, by now, if you look at the publications, there are, I think, more than 45,000 publications about long COVID. So that's a lot of information, isn't it? So what it means is that if I wanted to, I could cherry pick your publication to prove or disprove anything in the world. If you threw a question at me and said, can you prove to me that eating chocolate bars is bad for long COVID? If you gave me 5 minutes, I could probably find you a publication like that. I don't know if there is one, but I bet you I could find. I bet you I could have a look. Yeah, so I think we have to be careful. So and even amongst better medical journals, there's stuff that stands the test of time and turns out to be reproducible, and stuff that doesn't. And I just think as a community, we have to be very careful. So sometimes when I give research talks, I show a slide which kind of makes fun of us as a group of scientists, where You know how if you're a football supporter, you like to think it's a beautiful game where people pass the ball around very beautifully, and, they play perhaps, like the Spanish World Cup team or something. But if you watch some school kids playing football, it's not like that at all. Somebody kicks the ball as far as they can, shouts, and then they all run after the ball like crazy people. And something
Right.
like we're more like the second group than the first group. Yeah, somebody shouts something out, and we have, our craze for the moment, and it's we shout serotonin, or we shout T cell exhaustion, or we shout HIV, and everybody runs after the ball, and then we're all distracted for a little while, and then we calm down again. So I think we have to not be like that. We have to be more like a Spanish football team and sort of play the beautiful game, and not just run after something and shout. And so, if I have to pick and not to be rude about our hypotheses, but if I had to pick the strongest areas where there's a lot of action going on at the moment, in no particular order, obviously one thing that many people are excited about is a simple hypothesis would be many people in the world have persistent symptoms because they have a persistent virus somewhere in their body that's never been cleared properly. The idea of the virus reservoir. So that's a popular idea for good reason, because there's a lot of evidence out there about it. So if I listed a little bit of the evidence right at the beginning, when people were looking at autopsy tissue, tissue from people who died of COVID, which obviously by definition are unusual, very serious cases, they found this is a virus that can turn up in your brain, in your lungs, in your gut, in your muscle, you name it. But you could say, well, maybe that's exceptional because they were very sick people who died. But then if you look opportunistically at people who are going for endoscopy for other reasons and have bits of gut analyzed, you find that many of those people have bits of viral debris in their gut. And then if you try and correlate that with long COVID, like as a group in Innsbruck did, it can correlate rather well with having long COVID symptoms. And then fancier studies in a couple of labs recently, if you do very fancy analysis of imaging to look at where lymphocytes are going in the body using PET imaging, you find that, a year, 2 years into the story, they're still homing to the gut as if there's something there keeping them activated, as if there's virus there. So that all makes it sound very simple and self-evident. And it's not bad. The evidence is not bad. So you could say, well, if that's all true, why haven't we done something about it? And well, the answer is, some people have tried, things like Paxlovid trials to use antivirals to clear this reservoir, and that hasn't been black and white. That's been grey and very difficult. And I think the problem is that many companies would like to do things in this space and like to start trials in this space. And it's hard to design because if you can't prove who are the people you want to put into the study who definitely have that reservoir in their gut, you're going to get a grey answer rather than a black and white answer. So what are going to be your biomarkers to try and prove to yourself who are the subset, if you like, of long COVID people who have that reservoir who I really want to study and try and treat? So that's a kind of work in progress where I hope that good things will be possible. The only reason I've got slight doubt in my voice is, supposing it's even more complicated than we think, that some people have virus in their guts that they can't clear, and we plan to clear it, giving them antivirals or monoclonal antibodies or whatever. But what if the reason they haven't cleared it in the last 3 or 4 years is that it's not easy to clear? It's in some kind of overt state, hidden state, hard to get at state. And the same reason that your body hasn't cleared it the last 4 years may be the reason that the antiviral or the monoclonal antibody might not be good at clearing it in the trial. So that's the sort of the slight doubt that keeps me awake at night. But who knows? Anyway, so that's my first idea. The second idea that I think a lot of people like is that, like in some other sort of post-viral syndromes, the virus in some way sets up some kind of autoimmunity. And it wouldn't be hard to imagine, when you look at that symptom set, how that could be caused by autoimmunity. So autoimmunity obviously is immunologist jargon, where I mean that the immune response is normally designed to recognize viruses and bacteria and fungi and cancer cells and things. But at the end of the day, it's just a set of receptors that can recognize shapes, and normally they're meant to be edited so they don't recognize your own, proteins in your own eye, proteins in your own muscle, proteins in your own brain. But sometimes that goes wrong, and we can all name many diseases like that where it goes wrong, and you get autoimmunity, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmunity in your joint, multiple sclerosis, autoimmunity to your myelin sheath in your central nervous system, type 1 diabetes, autoimmunity to the beta cells in your pancreas that make your insulin. So we can all name and think of diseases like that and how they look. So where does the autoimmune idea come from? The first thing to say is that it must be a thing in COVID, because when people have done very big studies with electronic healthcare records that are very robust with millions of people, where you say, if we look at the first wave and we compare millions of people who got COVID to millions of people who didn't, and we look at what happened from over the next few years, and we say, what are the chances of developing a real autoimmune disease in the subsequent period? And you count in your national electronic healthcare records how many people have a new diagnosis of arthritis or type 1 diabetes or thyroiditis or vasculitis. And you find that having had COVID, your chance of having an autoimmune diagnosis roughly doubles, which is big on a nationwide level. So that tells you that this doesn't tell you how, but it tells you there's something going on. There's some kind of roadmap between SARS-CoV-2 and autoimmunity. And then lots of people, including ourselves, try and measure autoimmunity in terms of antibodies and T cells in people who have long COVID. And we certainly find new autoimmune antibodies in people who have long COVID. And the race is on at the moment, I think, to make that meaningful, to say, but how does that explain their symptoms? How does it correlate with their symptoms? And if we think that the causative thing is that autoimmune response, we're immunologists. We're meant to be quite good at turning off autoimmunity with drugs. We do it all the time for inflammatory bowel disease or type 1 diabetes or multiple sclerosis. Can we do it for long COVID? And that I think is coming around the bend quite fast. Okay?
Right.
Yeah. So the third one on the list is maybe a trickier one, isn't it? So there have been so many papers saying that it's a virus infection that perturbs or disrupts inflammation or immune subsets, and long COVID is a disease of immune dysregulation. And I think that's a sensible thing to say. And lots of people have measured lots of stuff, from inflammatory proteins in your blood to white blood cell immune subsets, and they find things that are different in long COVID. So that's useful, and that would be, reversible and treatable. Again, my hesitation slightly is that I think we can find things like that, but I think they're quite subtle and nuanced. So they're not enormous changes. So the challenge there is, how do we link those quite subtle changes that we see to the symptom set? The symptom set is enormous. All over the world, I'm talking about 400 million people who didn't used to have this problem, who are now variably, out of work, out of the run of things, because they've got this variable symptom set of brain fog or post-exertional malaise or breathlessness or gastrointestinal symptoms. So those are big symptoms, and I'm talking quite subtle immune system changes. So the pressure is on people like me to try and define, how do I join up those dots? How's that working? Yeah. And for my taste, the last one maybe the only other thing to say about that is that amongst the publications on autoimmunity, what some people have done is to take kind of classic hospital tests for autoimmunity. Like, if you want to go to a lupus clinic, they'll test you for certain lupus autoantibodies that have a very kind of defined set of specificities, or, various other diseases have various other sets that they test for in hospitals. When people have applied those tests to long COVID, some people find long COVID looking a little bit like known autoimmune diseases, like arthritis or like lupus, and then that's useful and interesting. So that's important. And the last, I think, mainstream hypothesis that I talk about is that, we all, I think, are very persuaded by the idea that your gut microbiome is really important. So all of those billions of bacteria that live inside us, that talk to our body systems all the time and inform our immune system and inform our brain and inform our function, that having a virus like SARS-CoV-2 on board can change your gut microbiota. And that we know lots of examples where that matters. So, all over medicine, there are examples where that's a big deal. Yeah. So if you're, I will say, a cancer immunotherapy patient, you're going to do better or worse depending on whether you previously took a course of antibiotics and disrupted your gut microbiota or not, because your gut microbiota is talking to your cancer cells and your immune cells and deciding on the outcome of that treatment. So, so it's meaningful and a big deal. So in something like COVID and long COVID, there's some interesting evidence out there that we've maybe disrupted our communities of bacteria in our gut. Maybe we've got fewer of some bacterial species that are the type that create metabolites, such as, for example, butyrate, where butyrate is very, very important for regulating and calming your immune system. So if you've got fewer of the bacteria that calm your immune system, you're going to have a more activated immune system, more inflammation, and perhaps that's leading into your long COVID symptoms. And again, if we had really strong evidence for that, we'd be able to think of lots of things to do about it, wouldn't we? We do a lot of therapeutics anyway in that field, don't we? Whether it's probiotics, giving actual things like pyruvate or butyrate as food supplements, whether it's giving people bacteria, for heaven's sake, for C. diff patients, we even give people fecal transplants. So there's a lot of stuff out there to treat those kind of things. So those are my kind of favorite ideas, really.
That's a really good overview of what's floating around in.
But I'll almost certainly have offended and irritated lots of people for the things that I haven't said. So the things that I haven't said, it doesn't mean I'm being rude about anybody's work. It doesn't mean I'm dismissing them. I know that some people would read this or hear about it and be shouting at me saying, why hasn't he talked more about coagulation, for example? And so I suppose what I think is that to some extent, I don't dismiss coagulation, but I include it in those other lists that I talked about, because I see coagulation as a consequence of perturbed inflammatory immunity and autoimmunity.
Is that also part of the whole puzzle? Because that's how I see like the entire field of long COVID research, right? It's you and a big bunch of other scientists and research groups around the world who are looking into different aspects, into all of these, let's say, 4 big hypotheses and all of the sub-theories that there are. But I guess this is also kind of the tricky thing, right? You have to understand at some point, where does it start? Because many of the symptoms, you mentioned there are 200 plus symptoms, and that's certainly true. But again, you and I, if we both had long COVID, I have, you hopefully don't, but if we both had the same, let's say, heart palpitations, this might not mean that we would get the same treatment that could help us, right? Because it could be having very different underlying conditions that would cause this. So I guess the real challenge for you would be to understand what manifestation is a symptom and then work your way maybe back to the source, maybe back to the cause, which is the big conundrum. Would that be kind of accurate to say?
That's all completely true, and when I talk about these 45,000 publications in the last 4 years on the subject, obviously that sounds like a huge number. And yet we're trying to do an urgent job very fast, aren't we? But, many people are quite bright, but they're not all geniuses. And, people have been working on lupus, multiple sclerosis, arthritis mechanisms for more than 100 years. And we're trying to kind of shortcut that 100 years into 3 or 4 years and get the answer and get the treatment and make people better. And we're not as bright as we think we are. We can't do it that fast. And people are getting very impatient with us, which I understand. And I suppose I suppose there's 2 things that I'm after. One is just the obvious, like researchers would always say, that surely if you were in government and you thought that the global cost for this was about $1 trillion a year, you might think it was worth investing a few million to try and mitigate it. And I've got to say that the German government has actually been better than many in terms of recognizing that. And the other thing to say is that if you had all of these bright scientists trying to do something about it, wouldn't it be good, instead of letting them kind of run away and build up their CVs and publish their papers and shout at each other, to force them to sit in a room together and knock their heads together and say, come on a minute, you've published all these markers, blood markers, biomarkers. Somewhere in there is the big answer. We're going to lock you in a room and not let you out until you agree on the big answer that we can test.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, it would be fantastic. And yeah, you alluded already at the impatience of patients. No word pun intended here, but there is indeed something I notice also, because I'm also in some online groups. There is, as you probably know, a huge support group on Reddit, which is incredibly fast growing, and it has 60,000 members by now. I think when I joined, it was 50,000 and something. So it's growing fast, and you see and you notice as a patient, and I see it from these both sides, right? From the point of view as a science journalist, but also being a patient myself, I see and I understand that I can feel this impatience somehow, because it's like people are, with those with the most severe forms, they are wasting away, and they are desperate for treatments, and they would honestly try everything and anything. But and we do have some medications that could work, right? I mean, if we think about, I don't know, something really cheap and simple like antihistamines. But for example, what I'm really wondering about is these are clearly just band-aids, right? These are not a cure for anything, but they can make life so much easier. What I am wondering is, like, all the research that you're doing, all the basic research, all the, and then hopefully also the interventional studies, it would, and I also want to disillusionize people here a little bit in terms of, like, how long would it take until something not just gets developed, because we know there is a pipeline for developing new medication, but also a pipeline that takes a long time to approve existing off-label medication for a different use. But what I'm really wondering is that the simplest strategies, like prescribing antihistamines, prescribing, I don't know what, metformin, if you will, for somebody who can't, or getting Paxlovid in case of a reinfection, is so difficult for so many patients. So my real question is, and sorry for the long-winding question, but like, how is it possible, or how could we make this better, that, or improve it, that basic research, that the newest research findings actually trickle down into PCPs or GPs' offices? Because so often no GP has ever heard of ME/CFS, no GP has ever heard of long COVID. Many are dismissive, and if they are not dismissive, they have no clue on what to prescribe you. How can we improve that?
I think it's very hard. I think, I had my wish list, didn't I, of more research and more kind of consensus. I'm going to add a third obvious thing to my wish list, which is that, we have so many ideas and so many drugs we want to try, and we're frustrated by the slow progress and by the small underpowered experiments and small underpowered trials. And
right.
The thing that, I keep on saying is that when we had the emergency of acute COVID in 2020, from my country, United Kingdom, actually did surprisingly well with the recovery trial, because of our being able to do quite rapid ethics and having quite a well joined up national health system. It was possible to take all of those different ideas that were floating around about things that might make people survive better during pneumonia on intensive care, and try them all out at an enormous scale across every hospital in England, and get an answer very rapidly for what worked and what didn't. And that changed treatment all around the world. And we absolutely have to do the same thing for long COVID, as in, we could probably put together a shopping list of the top 10 drugs that we want to try, and we need to trial them at scale in, cohorts of 20,000, 30,000 people, and work out what does it and what doesn't. And we can't win until we do that, and we can't convince general doctors to prescribe until we do that.
Definitely. So that's an interplay of probably also between politics and medicine or research, because you have to have a consensus first as to what can be prescribed off-label wise, right? What would be on your shopping list for drugs to try right now?
Yeah, I know. It's something we all talk about a lot. So of the big trials that or the medium-sized trials that are doing the rounds, there's some obvious things, aren't there? So things that have or are being trialed are sort of anticoagulation, antihistamine, colchicine, antivirals, anti-spike monoclonal antibodies. So those are your sort of first most obvious ones to do at scale. And then you come into kind of fancier things, don't you? Where you say, well, if I was regarding this as a classic autoimmune disease, I'd come in with some biologics that are used in classic autoimmune diseases, but they're dangerous and not without risk. So would I consider an anti-B cell therapeutic like rituximab, as is used very successfully in things like lupus and multiple sclerosis? Would I consider, well, there are many, don't want to name them all, but there are many biologics out there that are used in autoimmune disease. And if you were doing a carefully controlled trial, you'd want them on the list somewhere.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And as you say, some of them had pretty good results in other illnesses, in other diseases. So another question that I really hear and read often from patients is also something like, we've had this huge success with the vaccines, right? In a way, I mean, it's unprecedented how fast. I think it was less than a year until they were approved. Okay, it was an emergency approval, granted, but it was really, really fast. So what people now don't understand, and that honestly includes me, is if we have already existing medications and if we know they are effective in different treatments, it goes without saying this has to be thoroughly tested in clinical trials before you approve it for a different disease, for a different use. But why can't we expedite that? Why can't we be a bit faster with if a medication doesn't have to be invented like the vaccines that we got? If it's already there, why can't we expedite this the way that we did with the vaccines?
It is tricky, isn't it? I mean, you're into a sort of territory of difficult ethical debates, aren't you? Because on the one hand, to grant a license to do that trial, we're very wedded to the idea of evidence-based medicine. So, you want to take 20,000 people and you want to give them a fairly scary biologic that's not without risk. You have to go to the regulator and present your very clear build-up, your evidence base about why that's justified. And we will understand that and we'll relate to that. And that's the correct way to practice medicine. And I think what you're alluding to is another branch of the sort of ethics that says, well, hang on a minute. We also practice a different type of medicine sometimes, where it's the trial of the drug that informs you about the evidence and informs you about the mechanism. Because if you do a slightly higher risk trial where you say, oh, I treated with an anti-IL-6 monoclonal antibody like tocilizumab, and it made long COVID patients better, I produced, therefore, the evidence that IL-6 is a mediator in long COVID. So you do it the other way around. And that argument can sometimes be won.
Right. I usually always do a little bit of myth busting at the end of every interview. And there is this myth circulating around about immune dead. So there are even certain virologists who are saying, it's about time. We've had 4 years of no infection, which is entirely not true, but still, we've had 4 years of no infection. Our immune system is undertrained. Now we need to get infections to train it. What do you make of such a statement?
Again, I always try not to be confrontational or rude. But, like I said, I've been an immunologist my whole life. I've written hundreds of papers on immunology. Immune debt isn't a thing. There's no such thing as a kind of underdeployed immune system. So we all have a repertoire of many millions of T cells. Your T cells that are concerned with fighting Ebola virus are unrelated to your T cells that are concerned with fighting strep sore throat, which are unrelated to your T cells that are fighting the common cold. And there isn't some sort of joint bank account that they're all taking T cells in or out of. It simply doesn't work like that. It's a big misunderstanding.
It's not a thing is a clear statement. Thanks very much for that. Is there anything that you see popping up again and again, where you say, okay, I read this again in a tabloid or in a newspaper, and it just enrages me. It just makes me mad reading this again?
The thing that makes me most mad is that the medical establishment and politicians have been so slow to take this up and understand it. I keep on quoting all the big numbers and the big, health economics numbers, that we're so stuck in a kind of 19th century view of infectious disease that you get a virus, you get ill, you live or die, and a few weeks later you're better, and that's the end. Then you can close the book chapter. You've done the infection, it's over. It's time to move on from that, because when you look at infectious diseases, the world is full of things where it's not the acute infection that destroys you, it's the years afterwards. And that's true whether you're talking about a person with long COVID or a person in Latin America who's been bitten by a mosquito, who has chikungunya and for the last few years hasn't been able to walk and hasn't been able to hold a job, or the student who got glandular fever, Epstein-Barr virus, and has now not been able to go back to university for a couple of years because they're laid low. We need to rewrite those textbook chapters and get better at understanding that viruses can last a long time, and that you need to worry about the long viruses, not just the short viruses.